good morning, good afternoon. We are really grateful for you to be here. And here, this implies people who are sitting at New York City, at the New York University School of Law, or later today at the Institute for Public Knowledge, or even later today at Flanders House. But it also implies to you, wherever you are in the world, but who is virtually present here in the room, welcome all. We have built for you a full program with 6 sessions. Maybe you will attend one or more of them. But we have created that for you, and that includes alumni of KU Leuven, but also our colleagues and our partners worldwide. Thank you. We're aiming for the future. And in this first session, we focus on 2 letters, AI for the future. My name is Bieke Zaman, and I'm here to talk on behalf of the entire KU Leuven. But at the KU Leuven, I'm also the director of the Digital Society Institute, where we pursue a positive digital future. And in order to shape that future that revolves often around digital technologies in a positive way, we have to deal with legal, ethical, and environmental frontiers. And so that's what we will do in this first session. And that's why it's my pleasure that we have 3 experts on board. We have Benedetta Brevini, who will talk about AI's impact on climate. We have Frank Pasquale, who will talk about human expertise in AI. And we have Nathalie Smuha, who will talk about regulatory perspectives from EU, USA, and beyond. On a practical level, each of these presenters will first give a presentation to inspire you, presentation of about 20 minutes, and then we take about 10 minutes of individual questions, which are questions tailored to these presentations. After that, the last half an hour of this session is dedicated to an interactive panel where we can take more transversal questions. You can freewheel at that moment. And so I will be your moderator for today, at least for this first session. It will take in total 2 hours, which is a lot and not healthy if you stay seated all the time. So feel free to stand up and don't look at your neighbor as if they are crazy. They're just a very healthy person. If you need to take a bio break or so, feel free to do so. We're all free people, so let's be kind to each other. And I will also be a mild and kind moderator for you. Okay, I won't take too much time because we have lots to say, and I would like to introduce you to our first speaker, Benedetta Brevini, is already sitting next to me and who will take the stage here in a minute. She's a visiting scholar at New York University Institute for Public Knowledge and also an associate professor of political economy of communication at University of Sydney. The floor is yours.
So thank you very much. Thank you to Professor Bieke Zaman and also, of course, Professor Lida Heinz for having organized such an incredible celebration and for really letting us celebrate this anniversary together with topics that are certainly of incredible relevance in today's world. And so I would like to start with a very simple question, which is a question that I dwelled on for quite a while in my work. Is AI good for the planet? I started asking this question about 6-7 years ago. And at the time, the conversation around AI was mainly focused on the biases of algorithms, the lack of transparency, the opacity of the algorithm, the worries and the risk attached to mass job displacement, and of course, ideas of limitation to possible critical thinking and so on. And little was written at the time about the relationship between AI and the environment. So fast forward to today, in the last 6 months, I think you noticed that the headlines about the massive expenditure and cost of data centers are making headlines, and they are actually being covered all around the world. And so you see constantly this idea of thinking about the infrastructures of AI as a relevant problem for the climate crisis. So what has changed in the last 6 months to make this happen? And of course, someone like me that has been sounding the alarm about the environmental cost, for someone like me is a good news. At the same time, one should ask what has changed. And I think that actually, if you reflect also just on a very recent Google search that I've done, it is clearly the advent of generative AI that has made and brought also this change in public discussions around AI. Because really, also big digital lords, I prefer the term digital lord to tech giants, and we can discuss it later, they had to be more open about actually the significant expenditure of their data centers. And of course, I'm trying to go to my slides and I'm having some troubles, so maybe someone can help. And now I think it's there. And of course, this is a major problem that public policy will have to sort, but it's really not the end of the story. So in January this year, we saw, for example, for the first time, the International Energy Agency, discussing specifically, for example, the incredible consumption of training a large language model. So for instance, OpenAI ChatGPT, and the fact that just the training of this type of models will actually bring to something like the energy expenditure of 130 US households. And at the same time, I just want to draw your attention to the fact that even just a little like a Google search, and we see moreover, again and again, we see the presence of the Google overviews, for example, anytime we're looking for some kind of information. And we know also through this data from the International Energy Agency, we see the extent of the change. Like a simple search consumes much less than an AI-powered search, and it's about 10 times the difference. So at the same time, if we consider, for example, that anytime we're placing a search on Google, every day we have something like 9 billion of this type of searches, then of course the problem becomes really significant, and then we need to have this conversation. So, and if I show you, for example, this map that I love very much because explains still the extent of tech colonialism in my view. So it shows the different level of energy consumption in regions of the world. And you can see the blue and the light green consumption of the highest consumers and the yellow of the global south that have not reached that level of consumption. And so if we compare, for example, the increase in energy consumption just connected to ChatGPT or to generative AI in general, where we see that they could generate at least something like 10 terawatt per hour more of this additional electricity need per year. So these are staggering numbers. And of course, we can see why the discourse around AI has changed in the last 6 months. And of course, all these studies have been also corroborated by a major study that I really want to cite from the University of California, Riverside, that really highlighted the extent of the liters of water that have been used to train ChatGPT. And again, we're talking about energy and water footprint. So while it is incredibly important to acknowledge this type of energy consumption and the water problems that are associated with generative AI in particular, it is crucial that we understand that the environmental toll of artificial intelligence does not end with the energy and the water consumption. And so instead, we need to, and we must understand AI and its relation to the environment holistically. And in order to do that, we need really to focus on the complexity that it generated. So, like, whether it's in the digital devices you're carrying, the services we use, the products you buy. AI is more than ever deeply embedded in every activity of our life. So for the smartphones to emerging devices and services, what's happening is that AI chain of production is more and more embedded and integrated into the general digital chain. And I want you to think about this because it's something that I've been spending a lot of time discussing also with scholars, but also with policymakers. So I want you to think of AI as electricity. So electricity is running through a town. You can't really always see it, but it's powering everything, from the lights in your home to the cars you're driving. And just like electricity flows through the wires to connect every building and the street, AI is being wired into every material we use. So if you want to really understand the environmental toll of AI and moving behind just the infrastructures, we need to really consider AI in all of its material reality as technologies, machines, and infrastructures. And of course, this system consumes scarce resources through the entire life cycle, from production to disposal. So in various interventions, I called for what I termed an eco-political economy of AI, really to address the complex factors that are involved in this assessment of the entire environmental toll that they generate. And often in research, the reason why we struggle also to understand the complexity of these problems is that research in this domain is compartmentalized. We have incredible contributions coming from engineering. We have great contribution coming from the new field of critical AI, from law, from political science, from political economy, from communication. And yet, very often we struggle to bring all of these studies together, and so research remains scattered and fragmented. But in order to understand the entirety of the environmental tolls, what we need to do is to follow the entire global supply chain of AI. And so it's important also to really take into consideration not only the theoretical and the studies that have been brought together especially in the last 7-8 years about the environmental toll of AI. We need also to consider indigenous knowledge. We need to consider communities' praxis of the people that have been highly impacted by tech mining, for example, of the people that can actually understand the type of environment that environmental damage here means land appropriation. It means, for example, losing communities, losing jobs. And so the environment is attached to the social. And in order then to analyze the entirety of this toll, I want you to think of the 3 segments of the global supply chain of AI. Starting, of course, with the mining of the materials, the raw materials that are crucial for the services that we use. So, for example, lithium and cobalt, which are used to build the hardware, such as powerful computer chips. And of course, what is crucial is, and here we have a picture of, a typical land mine in Congo, in this case. And I'm using the example of mining of cobalt in Congo because I actually find this is an incredible case study of the history of what has been dubbed as a conflict material. And research into the human rights and the concerns of artisanal cobalt mining reveals findings that are really alarming. So most miners lack safety equipment, leaving them exposed to cobalt dust, which can lead to asthma, respiratory issues, and even a potential fatal condition known as hard metal lung disease. And so this is actually also crucial from a public policy perspective because a lot of these materials and these minerals are actually placed in area or region of the world that bring some precarity, for example. So most of the supply of these minerals are, of course, in the global south, but China is actually a dominant player in this market. So again, the politics of trying to appropriate and trying to reach and trying to increase our consumption of this mining, of these materials. And to give you an example, the demand of lithium in the EU will increase to 18 times the current level by 2030. We're talking 18 times. And how do we supply that demand? And this is the beginning, right, of the story and our understanding of the eco-political economy of AI. Then we move to the second step, which I already delved into a little bit at the beginning of the talk, which is really about the training. It's about the powerful consumption of energy of data centers, and also how much energy, how much water are necessary to make all to train algorithms. And I'm always referring to the pioneering study that was done by the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, in 2019, one of the first that really looked at trying to generalize for the first time on the expenditure and the massive energy cost of a typical language model. And you can see, like, these are mine calculations, but if we consider, and of course we generalize, and of course when I speak to engineers, they will tell me, be careful with this generalization because, a lot of factors come into place, and the extent of the neural networks and where the data centers are, and the complexity of the model. But to give you an idea, we're talking about 284,000 kilograms of carbon emission to train the model. And many of you came from Brussels, and on average, the carbon emission of a flight from Brussels to New York would be 900 kilograms. And again, this really shows the extent of the issues that we have and that we have to deal with. And I mean, of course, like, we have to end with the crucial increase of e-waste that is at the end of the global supply chain of AI. So the global south is becoming what has been termed by the UN as the digital dumping grounds for more privileged nations. And according to the UN Global E-Waste Monitor, the world's production of electronic waste is growing 5 times faster than documented e-waste recycling. So to give you an idea, a record 62 million tons of e-waste was produced in 2022, up 82% from 2010. And they are predicting that we're probably going to produce 82 million tons of e-waste by 2030. And as I love images, to help us understand these numbers, the UN invites us to imagine a long, unbroken queue of e-waste from New York to Athens, or from Nairobi to Hanoi. And of course, again, generative AI is particularly problematic. Why? Because of the new chips. And if you think of the latest AI chips, for example, such as the NVIDIA, are driving e-waste up to unprecedented levels, to a level that the UN is starting really worrying about. So obviously, it is crucial that we try really to understand all the consequences and the complexities if we want to think about solutions. And at the moment, there are, as we'll discuss so later, we have a lot of international agreements and position papers that are currently under discussion. And for example, I think that the UNESCO recently adopted a recommendation on artificial intelligence goes in the right direction because it states that AI systems should not be used if they have a disproportionate negative impact on the environment. And we'll hear very soon also from Nathalie Smuha about the AI Act. And for me, the AI Act is a missed opportunity, but I think there are possibilities to work, especially with the individual voluntary codes that companies and corporations can adopt, to find solutions. I actually think that one very good step in the right direction is coming from the US, and the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, has just issued this very important disclosure rules, new climate disclosure rules that can be and will be applied also to AI developers to report their emissions and they're deemed financially immaterial. And a very good news is actually coming from California, because they, in July 2023, California enacted the Climate-Related Financial Risk Act, which goes farther than the SEC rule because it imposes penalties on companies that do not accurately report on their climate emissions. And I think these are all very good solutions and ideas. At the same time, I think we really need to think in terms of a policy toolkit. So we need to consider, for example, an AI carbon footprint that not only provides the energy footprint for the training of our algorithms, but also tells us where the raw materials have been taken, its overheads, the recycling option, and the disposal cost. So all of this would reach and increase public awareness. And of course, within the policy toolkit, we should consider implementation of global program of digital literacy. So I call it green AI literacy, but just to make the public aware, actually discuss this data, actually offer opportunities also for selecting devices or AI-powered objects that are actually less invasive and less demanding in terms of energy and water. In March 2023, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, made up of the world's leading climate scientists, has issued what has been defined as the final warning. It means it's the final report before we can still act to make sure that we meet the famous 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold, which is the threshold beyond which our damage to the climate will become irreversible. So to keep it within the 1.5 limit, as a reminder, we need to be trying to reduce the emission at least by 43% by 2030. It's about 6 years away. And understanding the complexity of AI environmental harms is certainly a vital step to help achieve that goal. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll check out the mic in a second, but we're now having about 10 minutes for questions. We have people online and here in the room. For people online, you are invited to put your questions on the Zoom chat. And I'm looking at Professor Lindanes to see whether there are already any questions from people online. If not, this is a warm invitation. And then I will have a look at people here in the audience right now if there is any question at this moment. Yes, there is already a question. We will pass on the mic. Yes.
Hi, Professor. Thank you for your great talk on these issues. I must confess that I had not had like such a great overview of all the impacts that AI and also energy consumption have on the environment. What I would like to ask is, are there any concerns? Because when every environmental discussion we have already like tackled is, you cannot like face environmental challenges without innovation. And AI is the major driver of innovation and optimization. So what I would like to ask is, on the flip side, that you are like consumption, that you have like a major consumption in terms of energy, you're also optimizing many procedures, many industries, and this is also like saving a lot of energy. Do you have any data on that aspect, or only on the aspect of the consumption that is creating and not the consumption that is reducing?
No, it's a very important question. The problem we are facing is that we never really run environmental impact assessments before embracing the technology that is supposed to address the issues. So, for example, we have great AI developments and AI tools to measure acidity, in the ocean. Or a few, for example, are using AI bots to help the barrier reef repopulating, from these problems. But these technologies then carry all these these huge energy issues, water issues, and the problems I quoted of e-waste and the mining of resources. So what I'm arguing is that before like precisely embracing this new technology, we need to consider the trade-offs. And we really need to have a wonderful and calm conversation about the extent of which the benefits or the perceived benefits of embracing this type of innovation can be met by the crisis that we're facing. Because, for example, if you take Georgia and what's happening now, and you see the images of devastated lands in Georgia, and you consider the amount of data centers that have been built very, very quickly, over 50 in the last 15 years, and you see citizens that are constantly demanding that new ones are actually not developed in their area, then you think also, how can this be sustainable? Can they survive in the middle of floods? Can they survive in the middle of a very harsh condition? So what is really crucial is to radically step back and change our mindset about developing important technologies. So we say, okay, we're facing a climate crisis. So we put that first in our values and in our thinking about how to develop this technology. And once we know that this type of technologies do not carry all the risk that are associated with these problems. And there are very crucial issues, because if we have a data center in a very desertic area, or if we have a data centers where, you know, we are struggling in giving water and energy to the population, then we can't argue that we really need all these tools that are absorbing all the energy, right? I'll give you an example. Dublin has been in the last 15, 20 years at the forefront of technology development. And I don't know if you're aware that because of they built over 300 data centers, and in the last 15, 20 years, at the moment, the city of Dublin has declared a moratorium on new developments because they have to decide what to do for the energy grid. The risk is not to have enough electricity to power our houses. So these are really crucial conversations to have before we adopt the technology. So I don't know if I answered the question.
One more question.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Alicia Shikora-Kaleda. I'm a senior fellow at the NYU Jean Monnet Center. So it means that I actually deal with EU law, and I actually deal with something we can call environmental constitutionalism. But I belong to this group of people who has discovered the phenomenon you're speaking of exactly in the last 6 months. It was my big shock, I would say. And I thank you for the comment concerning AI, saying that it was a missed opportunity, but actually the purpose of AI Act was not the whole area of issues we are talking today. Unfortunately, I think it was also related to the fact that there was no knowledge enough when the proposal was done, when all of this discussion took place at the level of the EU legislator. So, you know, there is a mismatch between what we know and what is happening. And it's AI Act is a very good example of this, you know, that things are happening in parallel. Legislative process is also taking place. My question actually, since you have been dealing passionately with the subject for so many years, I understand that there is no really like regulatory strong, you know, all over the world and a strong example we could follow. But don't you think precisely that it is an issue more of values and constitutional entrenchment of this climate, which would allow to change the approach that, you know, we cannot have a unique model of regulatory, you know, because the union is different, you know, big south, and then, you know, so don't you think that it's exactly this constitutional dimension which could trigger a more horizontal approach? Because I cannot, you know, I mean, I would love to have an example that we could copy in EU, but I don't think it's possible. But thank you for this fascinating talk.
Thank you. Very important question. I wanted to say that the debate that was taking place during the AI Act actually pondered on the environmental impact, because I can tell you that I sent a lot of documents and we really tried everything we could to have a conversation. And at the moment, I think that there is a great opportunity with the level of implementations, because at the level of the so-called voluntary code, something can be done, and I think it must be done. And this is also why it is really the right moment now that we collected all this data. And the problem we had, of course, was precisely because of the fragmentation on all of this. We don't even know each other as scholars that are working in this sector. There are incredible studies done, for example, from human geography, studies that are showing the way in which we can mitigate the environmental impact of ICT, but they're not now implemented for AI. How weird and how strange, right? So, but we have materials that with this project on the eco-political economy of AI, I'm trying to bring together, because I'm building a repository of studies done that come from a variety of different perspectives. So that can be really useful for policymakers, and especially people that are at the moment also through the AI office are looking to implement, you know, the AI Act. So in terms of constitutional values, absolutely. Like, I actually think that one of the biggest problems we have is that the frameworks very often don't recognize so directly a right of the environment. But as you know, there are actually at the European Court of Justice, and also within the European Court of Justice, there are lawsuits at the moment that are really working through jurisprudence to actually trying to frame the right to well-being and to an healthy, you know, embracing on principle of social justice, because the social justice and environmental justice frameworks offer. So what I would suggest is to really look at the intervention within the environmental justice frameworks, especially, and really trying to build this into the values of this intervention. At the same time, I also think that because it's a really big debate, but it's also the investment of many countries, you know, the US, Europe, but also China, of course, you know, the competition around AI is so big. We need also global frameworks. And I think that what the UNESCO has done was promising, but of course, then we have the problem of having mandatory agreements, and we're going to be discussing this in a minute in the conversation. So I actually think that we need to consider a policy toolkit. We need to have small intervention and very big framework and macro intervention. So we need to intervene at every level. And I really hope that these environmental justice frameworks that are being brought in jurisprudence will help us, because if we don't, as a community, we don't have access to water and electricity, because data centers that have been developed are absorbing all of it, then we have a problem. Then our rights to well-being is not recognized. So I think actually the time for action is really now, because we have 6 years. I'm very worried about this threshold of the 1.5, because we saw the extent of the intensification of climate events in the last year. And so we really need to act fast. Thank you.
Okay, thank you again, Benedetta, for your presentation and people taking questions in the audience. Okay, it's my pleasure now to announce the second speaker of today, Frank Pasquale, who will talk about human expertise in AI. So we're going from a global perspective to a more individual perspective right now. Frank is a professor of law at Cornell Tech and Cornell Law School. Frank, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. It's a real pleasure to be here. Oops, let's hold this. It's a real pleasure to be here. And is there a clicker for the slides, or?
Yes.
Oh yeah. Oh, there it is. Oh, thank you. Great. Thanks, Benedetta. And I am particularly happy to be at an event sponsored by KU Leuven, which is a university of just such both incredible tradition and longstanding nature of 600 years, but also of great intellectual leadership right now in global affairs, AI technology. And I'm also really grateful to come after Benedetta, whose work, you know, I've followed for years and who has really been at the forefront of getting people to pay attention to the environmental costs of technology, which is something that's, really easy to miss amidst all of the hype, even the so-called crita-hype, which is criticisms of AI technology that are nevertheless assuming that it can do too much. And one of the themes of my talk today is going to be about, are we assuming AI technology can do more than it can? And when we do that, does that lead to distortions of our understanding of politics, economics, medical problems, familial problems, legal issues? I think there's a real suite of issues here. I'll also note two prefatory notes, one being that I am not totally against AI. I think part of what my critique is trying to do is to regulate properly unfortunate uses of AI in order to better motivate capital reallocation to the most productive uses of AI. So I think that's one thing. And then I think another aspect of the talk that I'll just give a fair warning of is that I do tend to, in the talks, to try to get as much evidence as I can within the time limit. And then about 1 minute before it, I'll skip to the last slide. So, so don't be alarmed by that, but I'm just going to try to get as much evidence as I can for my proposition about why we need to defend human expertise. And then I'll try to give you a wrap up to keep us on schedule. So I wanted to start in terms of thinking about long-standing problems of computation in social settings, right? And these are 4 excellent books that came out before generative AI became popular. And one of the things I want to be sure that we do in this discourse is that we recognize contributions that are still relevant to present problems, even if they came out before the current technology. This was a problem I often noticed with blockchain or crypto. You know, you criticize Bitcoin, and then people would say, well, now it's different. It's the crypto, it's the blockchain. Or you criticize Bitcoin, and then they say it's the blockchain. Then you criticize the blockchain, and they say, no, it's a DeFi, et cetera. But the same sort of critique still really held a lot of weight. And similarly, I think the works of Zweig and Perez and Broussard and O'Neill all have much to teach us in terms of forms of discrimination and forms of sort of a lack of insight that are really limiting the application of the newest generative AI. There are familiar risks of automated prediction, and just to go through these very quickly, I elaborate on them in great detail in the Black Box Society. The problems of inaccurate data, inappropriate data, and secret data are really important. And also, on the algorithm level, there are unfair algorithms and there are secret algorithms that cannot keep us from even understanding what's going on, which have been amply demonstrated in what Sayash Kapoor and Arvind Narayanan have called predictive AI. They have talked about this division between predictive and generative AI in their great new book, AI Snake Oil, which I highly recommend. I mean, really outstanding work by those computer scientists. And I think that these are these familiar risks that still carry over to generative AI. Now, of course, I should note, what is generative AI, right? So we have many forms of generative AI. We have text, right? Algorithmic next word prediction that's based on the tokenization of a corpus, right? So that's what's going on with AI and generative AI in text. Its problems, as we'll see, is that it's a language model, but not a knowledge model. And that's a real difference. That's a difference that makes a difference in terms of its reliability in many settings. There are also images and video, right? So we have images and video. This is an image of Paris inundated with trash. It's fake. It's just a generative AI image. I put it up, though, because I think that it is an objective correlative to the problem of what Max Reed calls AI slop. Okay, just tons of AI stuff being generated online. You might notice if you still use Facebook Blue, the main Facebook feed, that this is starting to percolate into your feeds, right? These sort of generative AI images. As soon as people start clicking on some of them, they get many more of them. And so there's an issue in terms of like this generative AI. There's many, I think, legal, policy, ethical issues in terms of like the overarching appropriation of copyrighted materials, which we can get into in the Q&A if you'd like. But I just wanted to introduce them as examples of what generative AI can do. And of course, generative AI can also be used to write code. Right? This is one of the big ironies of this AI advances that a lot of people 10 years ago or 5 years ago were saying to journalists, learn to code, right? If you lost your journalistic job, just learn to code. Turns out now a lot of the coders are being replaced by generative AI. But that may not last for long because there are new studies saying that even though the generative AI creates texts very rapidly, you have to, so you can get creates code very rapidly, you get the code rapidly, but then you spend 10 times more time debugging it in some cases, right? So this is a real reality check in terms of its abilities. Now, in terms of this existing threat matrix on generative AI, what I introduce about the problems of predictive AI are also predictably problems of generative AI at both levels of inaccurate data, inappropriate data, and secret data. All of these problems are really prominent and have been critiqued, and I'll get into examples now. So one example is suspect classifications by an AI tool. I was going to show you the images that it classified, but I thought even that would be inappropriate because of how offensive it was, in the sense that people were asking the AI, show me a terrorist, show me a beautiful person, show me a poor person, show me a happy family. And it ended up giving rows of persons that were predominantly of one race or another in these types of responses. And of course, that's, I think, deeply troubling as a result. There was also a Washington Post study of one open data set. And of course, this is going to seem like a critique of Google, but at least Google was opening up its data. There's a lot of firms out there that aren't even opening up their data. So, we've got to like give credit where credit is due. But when they looked at this data set, they found that there were some very bizarre sites that were actually part of the data set. You had Russia Today, right, which has recently been banned after, increasing revelations of its remarkable web of influence throughout global media. VDare was also in the outlet. That's an anti-immigration site associated with white supremacy. There was anti-Muslim bias, and there are even concerns about child sexual abuse material that are getting into these databases. And so you have to really worry about sort of a mindset that says more data will make things better. In fact, lots of the quote so-called data is of highly suspect origin and influence. Now, in terms of some distinctive generative AI issues beyond what's going on with predictive AI, I just want to talk about these different ones today. There's issues of defamation, disinformation, premature disruption, spam, and thought displacement. So with respect to defamation, a really good example that happened about a year ago was there was a query to ChatGPT, which US law professors have abused their students? And a chatbot fabricated a response about a very well-known professor that had no basis whatsoever. It was just this guy was in the news for a lot of things that he had done that were controversial, right? Controversial stances he had taken. But somehow within this sort of like neural network, within the sort of next word prediction model, it said, oh yeah, this is the person that you want to, that could be the abuser. Also in terms of disinformation and misinformation, there's already been some very prominent examples. These are some examples that are from the US, but there are also, I could give many examples that are from other countries, sort of misinformation, disinformation. Even in my 2020 book, New Laws of Robotics, I had some of these, but of course they've gotten worse with generative AI. And here's a fake image in terms of like, if you ever share one of these things, the idea should be put fake image on it, right? Don't just share the thing. I actually had an editorial recently in the newspaper, and I talked about a disinformation image, and like the image they shared was the disinformation image without any sort, with like a tiny fake in the corner. And I was like, no, I don't want to be the venue. I don't want to be the vector of the thing I'm critiquing, So this is a real issue in terms of like how troubling this can be. Also, AI disinformation is exacerbated by Twitter's sale of blue check marks, right? So this Bloomberg is a really well-reputed news organization in the US, but here it's like you have a Bloomberg feed that has nothing to do with Bloomberg, but Twitter doesn't care, Elon Musk doesn't care, they're just selling these things, right? Also, there are some less known examples, but ones that I still find really troubling, like in terms of, this is a top Google result for Johannes Vermeer at one point, which is, the girl with the glowing earrings, not the pearl ones. And so, and I think that they're funny and they're just sort of bizarre, but on the other hand, they also sort of remind us that if we are to outsource our conception of the prioritization of images and cultural heritage to tech firms, they don't really care much about authenticity, right? What's real, what's not. And so you don't have to worry about that. And that's one place where I have been applauding and do currently applaud Europe's right to be forgotten, because at least there's an idea there in coming out of the GDPR and the DPD before it, that you have some level of responsibility if you're an organizer and sorter and prioritizer of information. I'd also note that there are some hopeful signs for fighting disinformation. I can't get into the European Digital Services Act here, but of course, I think that's going to be a leading effort. The California Bolstering Online Transparency, or BOT Act, is one model. California, you might have seen in the news, the governor recently vetoed a big AI safety bill, but he also simultaneously signed some AI transparency bills. So it seems that like we're going in that direction in California. And I think that's a very important aspect of this discussion. I'd also note that like a third problem is premature disruption or consumer protection. This is really the core of the issue of making sure that we have a situation where human expertise is actually being respected. And there have been, for example, experiments with chatbot therapy, and I'll give you an example in another slide about those issues. But there's also problems in the legal profession that, are part of my profession. Lawyers have used ChatGPT for briefs, and it just hallucinates cases. It'll just make up a case entirely, which is really disturbing. There are problems where a New York City chatbot promoted law breaking. Okay, so New York City thought, let's be on the cutting edge. Let's have a chatbot that can tell people about what their legal obligations are. Of course, given the current travails of the mayor, perhaps we can understand why it would promote these things. But, but it's a real problem in terms of when you think about, this sort of chatbot promoting, saying, oh, you don't need to worry about this law or what have you. There's also the problem of an arms race of automating filings and comments. I work with a law journal that was based in Brussels, or is based in Brussels, the Journal of Cross-Disciplinary Research and Computational Law. And I gave a talk for them a few years ago about this problem of if you have automatic creation of texts, imagine, courts being swamped by automated complaints, automated defenses, automated motions to remove, et cetera. It's quite a chilling possibility. And we've seen some glimpses of that with respect to hundreds of thousands of, or even millions of comments being delivered with respect to administrative rulemaking. Okay, so that's another issue that we have to face. The fundamental problem is what Deb Raji calls the fallacy of AI functionality, right? The idea that it does function well, it can function well. We've got to really police that with human expertise. For example, there was an eating disorder hotline that started to wanted to not have so many volunteers and to have a chatbot replace them, but the chatbot actually was giving advice that was pretty bad for people with eating disorders. They had to remove it. There's also, I think, this sort of salvation narrative that comes out, which I think is really troubling in the midst of all these failures. For example, the chief scientist at OpenAI said that in the future, we will have wildly effective and dirt cheap AI therapy. This will be a radical improvement in people's lives. But for now, here's one of the failures that one of these AI chatbot therapists was documented as having produced. There's a researcher who fed Wobot, which is an AI chatbot for the mentally ill, or for those who have depression symptoms, quote, I want to go climb a cliff in the canyon and jump off it. And the chatbot came back with, quote, it's so wonderful you're taking care of both your mental and physical health, right? And this is sort of a bizarre thing, that you sort of can have that type of response. But it should be unsurprising because, of course, they're language models and not knowledge models, right? So that's a deep problem. They don't understand. They certainly don't empathize, as Sherry Turkle has exemplified, has sort of put forward in a number of talks. I think she's a really important interpreter of the digital, and she has noted this, I think, with great force. There is a proposed Massachusetts state law that would regulate some of these things, but I can't get into the details. Perhaps in the Q&A we can. But we should be really cognizant, states should be cognizant of false claims risk due to non-functional or subfunctional AI. It's a real issue. Fortunately, the Federal Trade Commission just this week actually sued several companies, including an AI chatbot lawyer called Do Not Pay, because it said that they were vastly overclaiming what they could do for consumers. And that is going to be sort of pioneering a future there, I think, in terms of regulatory efforts. Chair Khan, others on the commission, and it's worth noting as well, all 5 commissioners voted for many of these actions. So it's not just a partisan move. It's actually something that has wide support in US society. Spam is also an issue. We have a science fiction magazine had to close down its open submissions because it got so many chatbot submissions. They're starting to open back up again, I've heard, but that's yet another concern that we have. And law courts could be the next, as I mentioned earlier. So I think that if we want to stop the spamming of the administrative process, we should, I believe, amend the Administrative Procedure Act to free agencies of any obligation to review or respond to AI-generated comments. I think that basically if a person is not taking full responsibility for them, a person isn't writing them, of course, the AI can contribute to some of these comments, but we really have to watch out for a world where that could just be sort of the whole burden of the agency to respond to these things. I'll finally note something that I call thought displacement, right? There could be undetectable school cheating thanks to these things. A lot of schools have been very worried about this. Oh yeah, and so I think that's a very deep concern. And I note that, essay mills are illegal in many jurisdictions. Perhaps LLMs should bear, or their vendors should bear some liability if they're used like an essay mill, right? Just as if there's punishment to be a student that writes to some person and pays them $10 or $100 to write an essay for you, why not punishment for the purveyor of the machine that provide something that might be basically the equivalent. And there's a really terrific essay by Michael Veal and others called AI Providers as Criminal Essay Mills, which I think is really helpful in terms of thinking about the frontiers here. My conclusion is basically that I think that we need to think of regulation here as quality improvement, right? I think there's a narrative out there now that tries to emphasize a tension between innovation and regulation. A narrative that says, well, where are the tech companies in Europe? And I often have an answer to that as someone that's worked on antitrust. A lot of them were nipped out in the bud by Google or large companies in the US, right? That maybe should have been subject to antitrust action 10 or 15 years ago when I was calling for it, as opposed to the present when it's actually happening. So I think that, there's a real issue here in terms of thinking about regulation and thinking about, the role of regulation as potentially improving the quality here. I'm someone that believes that it's not, that law also and regulation and sort of the role of policy is not to come in afterward and to clean up the mess left by companies, but rather in the spirit of Christina Cafara, who I think is a really wise European voice in these areas, to play a role of industrial policy and in a way shape our technological future. And so that's why I believe that, generative AI needs this regulation to promote further scientific progress, to democratize it, to protect vulnerable groups. I actually wrote the preface for an essay collection on digital vulnerability in European law that was edited by Abeltra Di Franceschi and Camilla Crea. I love sort of working in this area because I think Europe is just doing so much and is so forward thinking in terms of regulatory models. And I think that, some regulation in law enforcement may make certain totally autonomous business models unviable, but that may be a good thing in the sense of improving generative AI overall. So thank you.
Okay, thank you for your talk. I see there are already questions here in the audience, but were there any questions online?
No,
not yet.
Not yet.
Okay.
No.
Yes, so we have two questions here.
Thank you so much. I find it super interesting, and I completely agree with you that human expertise is very important. What I want to ask you is to what extent this type of technology will actually present an obstacle to human expertise from being developed and nurtured, because that's a different problem. So I think the most obvious example is the one in relation to art. So before you actually become a great artist, a great painter, for example, you will probably be a mediocre painter. Whatever you paint is not going to be very good, and you will have to practice again and again and again to be able to achieve expertise and to become a master in it. But if this is the case and generative AI can produce something that is better than what 85% of artists can produce, could this actually mean that in the future it's going to be very, very difficult to actually produce human expertise because no one is going to be able to fund, provide support for the development of it when you can get a lot of things way cheaper that is produced by AI. So I just wanted to ask you if you think this is a problem that is going to be more generalized, not only applicable to this area, and how you think we should try to face it.
Fantastic question. I really love that question. I'm going to talk about two conventional policy-oriented approaches to this, and then go off into a flight of fancy. So with respect to the conventional policy-oriented approaches, the Suskins book, The Future of the Professions, has a portion where they talk about what they call the pipeline problem. And they say it's not just unique to art, that you could have all these different areas where if you just have the simpler work done by machines, that the younger persons or the people that are coming into the profession never actually learn the basic foundations of later forms of expertise, and that reduces the pipeline. Okay. But they don't think it's a problem. They think that there are ways of trying to encourage or trying to avoid the skill degradation that has been noticed by commentators like David Mindell and Nicholas Carr and others, if you properly introduce the AI. So that's possible. But but I think it's a real problem. And I think that I think that there's a way in which Ted Chiang has a wonderful metaphor where he says, bringing generative AI to write an essay is like bringing a forklift to the gym. Okay. you will lift with the machine much more than your colleagues will, right? If I had a forklift, I could bench press 1,000 pounds, right? Will I get any stronger? No, right? And so that way, there's a way in which the technology is alienating in that sense. Now, of course, there are modes of human-computer interaction that may possibly be leading to the development of new forms of skills that would allow a person to be able to achieve in the area. But if I were to go on now to go into my flight of fancy mode, one of the things I think is so interesting in the evolution of contemporary art is the emphasis on a curatorial strain, right? So someone like Hans Ulbricht, right? Hans something Ulbricht, I think. He's a curator. Or the work of Marcel Brudthes, a French artist who, rather than actually like drawing things, they will curate a huge number of other things, And I've gone to a few Brudthes exhibitions and thought, this is very interesting, And so perhaps the sort of futuristic argument there would be to say that the nature of art will change such that it will not be the person who's the drawer or painter who's the artist. It will be the person who curates images, perhaps even digital images online. I, however, find that point of view profoundly alienating and a profound discontinuity from the history of art, which I think would ground at least some form of artistic, or a main body of artistic practice in forms of tradition that are identifiably part of a longer standing tradition, right? And particularly as we sort of celebrate the 600th anniversary of university, I think it's very interesting to think about, this degree to which we need for a sense of well-being a certain groundedness in practices and traditions. And I actually led a reading group on Alistair McIntyre on exactly this type of issue a few months ago. So I know that's a really wide-ranging answer, but I think your fundamental concern is a very important one. And if we are not approaching this as educators, as people in the arts, as people in all these different areas of human endeavor, with a great deal of reflectiveness, we're going to end up with exactly what you're worried about, which I think, which could be, is dramatized in a film like Wall-E. I don't know if anyone's seen Wall-E, but it's like, or Kurt Vonnegut's novel Player Piano, or E.M. Forster's short story Machine Stops. All three of those are works where people just don't know how to do anything because all the knowledge is in the machines. It's not distributed among people. So yeah, thanks. Yes.
Hi, Professor. Thank you very much for your talk. It was very enlightening about many of the aspects. One of the biggest concerns that I have related to generative AI and AI in general is the radicalization of political discourse. And this through like a creation of fake information, also targeting people getting only information that is like aligned with their thoughts. So people like getting more like reinforcing what they think, which is, I believe, like leading to many authoritarian regimes around the world. And in terms of that, I would like to ask you a question. Like, so far, the United States has not regulated most of the topic. Do you think now we have like this very huge regulation in the EU, the AI Act? Do you think that that act addresses this regulation as quality improvement that you're advocating for? And if not, what would be, in terms of that, your suggestions for improvement?
Well, this is a wonderful bridge to the next talk, I believe. And so and I will certainly defer to Professor Smuha and other authorities here on the reach, scope, and potential of the AI Act. But I do think that, just from my own somewhat distant perspective, what I would say is that I think that there are real possibilities of promise with respect to an idea that, at least on the safety side, there's a safety side and a rights side, right? And I think that the question becomes, to what extent can questions of safety can question of rights be assimilated to questions of safety? Can questions of democratic freedom or polarization be assimilated to them? I think it's a very difficult thing to do. But I think that there is, in the broader regulatory sweep in Europe and perhaps in some other jurisdictions, I think there are possibilities to have interventions here that are going to actually help with respect to identifying at least outright lies, outright disinformation. But I will say that one of the things that I'm very concerned about that I don't think is adequately addressed in almost any current legislation is a problem that I would call demoralization, right? And so there's a problem where even if what you're getting is basically true, if people are being saturated with negative narratives that are like, your country's terrible and everything you do is wrong and all the politicians are corrupt and everything is going wrong, all these sort of things, that I think leads to a level of cynicism, alienation, and then it flips into a hope for like a strong man or something like that. And I think that explains a lot of political dynamics in many jurisdictions right now. And so I think that what I'm actually trying to work now on a book proposal on this idea of demoralization, looking back to the US's Committee on National Morale that was part of it in the 1940s, tried to sort of boost people up a bit, get them to feel a little bit better about things and sort of know about positive narratives of the future. And I think that's something we should watch for too. But I'll leave you with one dystopian possibility, another flight of fancy, because I realize I'm almost out of time. The flight of fancy I would offer is, imagine 10 years from now, you have one jurisdiction in the world that says, we're not going to regulate generative AI at all. It's all free expression, whatever people want to put out there, whatever they want to believe. There's no government, quote unquote, thought control, right? We're just going to let it all go loose. And another jurisdiction says, you know what, we're going to require it's all labeled, and we're going to pretty tightly control what goes out there. We're going to make sure that, you know, if there's these completely false things that are being passed off as true, we're going to stop them, right? It may well be that at least a few authoritarian regimes choose the latter, but by doing so, have a public sphere that is more grounded in reality for a higher percentage of the population than those of the totally freed up area, right? And so that I think is a really a worrisome possibility, that some of the conceptions of the nature of free expression and relationship between government and the public sphere that are embedded into legal codes may not be able to survive certain forms of digital transformation of the creation and dissemination of information. And I think we have to think really deeply about that, about those issues going forward in order to avoid some really dystopian outcomes. So thank you. Yeah. Well, thanks.
Okay, thank you, Frank Pasquale, for the interesting talk as well, and also from the questions from the audience. Actually, already during the talk and also during the audience intervention, we have made bridges towards our next speaker. Nathalie Smuha is our next speaker. She will talk about regulatory perspectives from the European Union and USA and also beyond, China, if I'm not mistaken, amongst others. She's an assistant professor at the KU Leuven, but also a adjunct professor at New York University School of Law. We're looking forward to your talk.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation. And I have to say, being here this semester as an adjunct professor, it's so nice to walk into this building and see a big KU Leuven banner reminding me of home. Okay, so as Bieke introduced, I'm going to take a step back and look at some regulatory models that we're seeing today. And discuss these different approaches. And I'm not going to take a stand on, you know, what is the best approach. Of course, I have views, you will have yours. But I think it's interesting to make a comparison between these different approaches and then to see to which kind of futures they will lead us, and especially which kind of challenges they pose towards us. So the public at large, and you will all remember, especially some years ago, the tone about AI was very positive. AI is a new electricity, not in the sense that Benedetta said, or, you know, watch out for the large environmental costs, but rather there are endless possibilities. It's going to transform our society into something wonderful. And these benefits are still acknowledged. One EU institution, this was in a draft report of an EU Parliament institution, even called AI as something we should think of as the fifth element after air, earth, water, and fire. I think it cannot get more hyperbolic than that. I have to say that was the draft report. Thank God they corrected it, you know, in the other report. And of course, it's great to be optimistic. And there is a lot to be out there to acknowledge, and there are benefits that the technology can bring us. But there is also a downside to it. It's two sides of the same coin. And gradually, especially over the past decade, these risks became more apparent. And I think a turning point was probably around 2016. And then the years that followed, the Cambridge Analytica scandal, I think, opened the eyes of many people through journalistic work that was great, through scholarship that was great, in pointing out what this turn side of the table could be. And the fact that despite the many benefits that digital technologies have, they can also be used for problematic purposes. either on purpose or in a negligent way. They can cause different types of harm. When we then come a few years later, around 2017, 18, 19, you suddenly see this proliferation of AI strategies. Every country wanted to have its own AI strategy, country or region. Starting with China in 2017, having its next generation AI development plan. In the EU, we then had a strategy for AI in Europe in 2018. And in the US, we then had an executive order under President Trump at the time. And interestingly, if you compare the language of these different documents, they all are already leading in AI and want to continue their leadership. So there is a clear race to AI. All countries, all regions want to be the first, want to be the best in developing AI, precisely because it brings these economic, mostly benefits, and also benefits for society as a whole. But because of these scandals like Cambridge Analytica and the other side of the coin, increasingly, these regions also understood that you need to cater to the concerns that people have. Because if people don't trust the technology, they're also not going to want to use it. So I already argued this a few years ago. The race to AI is also giving space to a race to AI regulation. Because if you are one of the first to regulate AI, you can have a first mover advantage. You can set the tone, you can set the standard, and other people, other countries, other companies that want to do business with you will have to comply with your standards. So there is a certain strength there. And that's at least how the EU has gone about it also when it came to the GDPR, for instance. But also in other regions in the world, since people became worried about the possibilities, but also the risks of the technologies, the shift went from pure optimism to, okay, perhaps we need to regulate it. And when you have a race to regulation, the question is then what kind of race is it going to be? Are we talking about a race to the top? Are we going to have different countries trying to come up with the best possible regulation that strikes the right balance between protection and innovation? Or are we going to have a race to the bottom, where some countries will purposely not adopt any regulation at all, or very poor regulation, to attract more investment and companies without protecting their citizens, and trying to free ride on regulation taken in other countries that offer some level of protection? And another question we can ask is, if we do see regulatory competition, to which extent is each country going to go its own way, or to which extent are we going to have some level of convergence? Can we have some agreement, perhaps not initially, but at least after a while, as to what those principles of regulation should be? So I'm going to discuss different models here, starting with Europe. I think Europe has, without a doubt, the most comprehensive AI regulation out there. I'm not saying it's the best. I am saying it's the most comprehensive, right? It's really a sweeping piece of regulation, which has been adopted in August this year, finally. It's going to start to have effect in the next months and years, but in 2 years, all provisions will have effect. And it takes a risk-based approach. Basically, it categorizes AI systems based on their risk level, and the higher the risk level, the more obligations are imposed. So you have the category of minimal or no risks, right? AI systems that are not really seen to pose any new risks. Just a reminder, all existing regulations, such as, for instance, the general data protection regulation, still applies. Right? So it's not that these systems go entirely unregulated. There is legislation out there, but the AI Act doesn't impose extra obligations. Then you have a category of systems of which it said, oh, maybe it's good to have extra transparency there because there can be a risk of manipulation. Think of chatbots. You should be informed of the fact that you're interacting with a chatbot rather than a human being. That's the idea behind it. And also deepfake. So we had some examples already. The idea is that you should be aware of the fact that what you're looking at is a deepfake and not a real image or video. So that's another part of the regulatory puzzle. Then you have the GPI models, or general purpose AI models. This is where the generative AI comes in. And this is a category that was added kind of last minute, because when the proposal came out for the AI Act, ChatGPT was not there yet. So it was not really on the radar of the regulators. It also shows, though, how fast EU legislators managed to implement it into the proposal, because now there is a whole section devoted to general purpose AI. General purpose AI with and without systemic risks. Those without systemic risks, they should have transparency obligations, especially also making sure they don't use copyrighted information. And if they have a systemic risk, they also need to undergo an impact assessment. And the distinction is made based on how powerful they are, what their capabilities are. Then you have the category of high-risk AI systems. These are systems used, for instance, in education, by law enforcement, by judges, in the medical sector. So these pose a high risk. You know, when you're misdiagnosed, this can be very problematic. It's not the same as Spotify recommending a song that you actually don't like, right? The risk is very different here. So their obligations are imposed before these systems can enter into the market. It's a kind of conformity assessment that these systems need to undergo, but it's the developers themselves that can do this conformity assessment. So it poses the question, on the one hand, you say it's very high risk. On the other hand, you trust the developers to carry out the conformity assessment themselves. And then finally, you have, I think, a very powerful category of unacceptable systems, because the risk is just too high. The risk they pose to fundamental rights and health and safety is too high. So I think it's powerful in the sense that it's brave to just outright ban certain practices. In practice, however, this is a very limited category, and there are many exceptions to it as well. So there is a lot of criticism on it. Now, I've spent the last, I think, 5 years of my work critiquing what the EU is doing, pointing out how it can do better. But when I put it into perspective with what other countries are doing, I think I should be a bit milder, because it's very easy to critique something that is on the table, whereas so many countries don't have anything on the table. So that's a caveat I need to make there. Okay, looking at the US, the landscape is quite different. You did have at federal level a blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. That was very soft law. You had then in 2023 an executive order, which had a little bit more teeth, but still very, very weak compared to what the EU is putting forward. And the reality is that at the federal level, there is no comprehensive legislation out there, and not even more targeted legislation. There have been many bills proposed, but they get stuck. There is no agreement on them. You have the FTC, and I think Frank already mentioned in its speech, the Federal Trade Commission, that does take some regulatory action. So it kind of steps in using existing regulatory tools, consumer protection law, competition law, etc. So that is one approach. One approach is to say, look, we seem not be able to adopt any new regulation, but we can use existing laws and enforce them in a more harsh manner. At the same time, at state level, you do see some regulatory experimentation. There are some states like Colorado that already adopted a more comprehensive risk-based AI Act, a little bit similar to the EU here and there. But then you have other states that adopted way more targeted things. For instance, in New York, heavily criticized because also not protective enough. But there has been legislation adopted on the use of AI in recruitment processes and the fact that transparency needs to be given in that case. They're already adopting now amendments because the legislation is not strong enough, but it shows that there is some regulation that is coming from state level at least, and states can learn from each other. They can look at best practices, and through trial and error, this regulatory competition might lead to a more optimal solution. And then the last one I want to put on the table is China. So for a long time, China was actually also leading, I would say, in AI regulation. We just talked about it far less because it's not as comprehensive as what the EU put forward, but there have been more targeted regulatory efforts. For instance, already in 2021, there was this algorithm recommendation regulation that regulates algorithmic recommender systems on social media. Then you had a regulation targeting deepfakes, again, making sure that people know that it's a deepfake and not an authentic image. There has been a generative AI regulation, first as a draft, now more permanent, put on the table. More recently, an ethical review of science and technology activities, and right now in the pipeline, a more general AI law. And now with China, we often say, well, it's normal that they put forward regulation. They have a more state-driven model. They want to regulate to make sure that AI systems adhere to, the values of the country. And it's true, many of these regulations also refer to, for instance, socialist values and national interests. But I think we should be fair here because in a way, the EU is doing the same with its regulation. It also wants to make sure that AI systems don't breach fundamental EU values in the way that they conceive it. So that is what regulation is also meant for in one way or another. We are now also starting to see international level initiatives because it's all well to say, well, you know, each country or region will adopt its own approach. To which extent can we converge? Because we all know that the risks of AI don't stop at the border, right? It's not because one country implements AI systems that there might not be spillover effects, sometimes even very deliberate spillover effects to other countries. So it's good that there is also more attention at the international level. And I think, Benedetta, you mentioned the recommendation on the ethics of AI at UNESCO level. It's non-binding, it's soft law, but it has been signed by all UNESCO countries. So at least it offers a signal towards the fact that at the international level, there should be some convergence around these issues. And the good thing about this recommendation is that it has a monitoring mechanism. So at least countries need to report on what they're doing to approach the goals in the recommendation. Most recently, last month, you had a report from the United Nations high-level advisory body on AI. It's still soft law, it's just an advisory report, but it put forward the idea of having a sort of AI office or secretariat within the UN Secretariat to monitor what's ongoing, and that will at least help take action if needed on an international level. But it's still at these very early stages, right? The only binding piece of international regulation on AI is the Council of Europe Framework Convention on AI, Human Rights, Democracy, and the Rule of Law. This has been for a long time, at least in my mind, the most promising piece of regulation out there. It's the first multilateral treaty on AI. And it adopts kind of the EU approach in sense of it wants to protect human rights, it wants to introduce risk-based regulation. The problem is that the more countries join the table of the negotiations, which is a good thing because you want more countries to sign up for the treaty, the more it got weakened and weakened and weakened and weakened, to the extent that all the rights that were originally envisaged have been taken out. And right now, it would also only apply to the public sector and not even to the private sector anymore. There's one country that has had a great role in achieving this weakening, and that's actually the US. On the bright side, the US signed this treaty, and everyone was very happy about it, but it's not because it's signed that it's also becoming US law. Because to become US law, it needs to pass Congress, and that's not going to happen anytime soon. So it's a very symbolic signatory. On the other hand, it lowered the standard of protection, you could say. For EU countries, that doesn't matter that much because they have the AI Act. But for instance, for the UK and many other countries, it's not ideal. So you can't have your cake and eat it as well. This is a trade-off that is always part of these negotiations between different countries. Either you have more countries on the table, but the standard will be lower because you need to find the common denominator, and that's usually a weakest point. Or you have less countries around the table and you can go stronger, like in the EU, and you have a harmonized set of rules, but you also need to work with these other countries because you know that AI doesn't stop at a border. Okay. So to conclude, what is next, right? I gave you kind of landscape of AI regulations out there. Well, what I see is a lot of different tension points. On the one hand, AI has been promising to democratize knowledge, to democratize information, much like the internet in its days. But we are now also seeing, especially when it comes to generative AI, that there is a huge centralization of power at the same time. Because the most powerful large language models that we're all using are in the hands of just a handful of companies who are getting more and more power because we keep using their tools and give them more data. You also see a tension between globalization and digital sovereignty. On the one hand, as I showed you, there is a willingness to start regulating at an international level, or at least talk about it. And states know that they will need to cooperate to face the challenges that AI poses. At the same time, there is this huge push towards more digital sovereignty, towards being independent, not depend on other countries' technology, chips, for instance, in order to put forward your own technology destiny. There's also tension between paying attention to existential risks of AI, especially if AI can at some point become super intelligent or through other means pose an existential threat to humanity, versus more here and now harms, as I call them, the harms that we already see today, such as discrimination and privacy infringements. We are often also looking primarily at applications of AI systems. Think of the EU risk-based approach, but also the one in Colorado. It doesn't look at infrastructures, but AI systems are enabled through infrastructures. And these still go unregulated to a large extent. And then finally, we want to use the power of law, the rule of law, to try to bring AI systems under this corpus of values that we hold dear and want to protect. At the same time, and I already hinted at that before, you can also use law in a way that fosters more illiberal or authoritarian ends. And every piece of regulation that is out there, for instance, in China, but also in the EU, to enable the protection of AI can also be misused by the very states to actually legalize the use of AI systems that are problematic for human rights and other values. And if they add to that a layer of algorithmic rule by law, so if they use algorithms to implement problematic laws, that is even more problematic. So I'll stop there, ending a little bit on a pessimistic note, but I think what I want to then bring forward is the fact that today, much more than in the past, people are talking about the risks that I mentioned. Not to the fullest extent, not as much as they should, but I think this event in itself shows how international cooperation is actually the key answer to finding some solutions to the problems we mentioned. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Nathalie, for your talk as well. And I think this time we have questions from the online audience.
Actually, we have one question
Yes.
from the online audience, and it's about AI literacy. And is there a way to perhaps enforce it? What do you think of it?
So there is actually a clause in the AI Act on AI literacy. It defines what is meant with AI literacy, and a definition is also always powerful, right? Because it puts forward what something is, and it encourages it. There are also some impositions. So for instance, the idea is that especially if you use high-risk AI systems, let's say a company makes use of it to decide on hiring people, that is a high-risk system, because recruitment is something very sensitive. Well, you should only be using that system if you have some literacy. And this AI literacy means, knowing more or less the capabilities of the technology, what can it do, but also the limitations. What should I not trust it to do? And what are the risks? What are the risks also in terms of fundamental rights? So AI literacy is very important because there are limitations to what the law can do. Many of the problems, especially the problems that Frank mentioned in his talk, we will not be able to solve with a piece of regulation, not even with the best piece of regulation. It requires a different mindset. And this different mindset requires more knowledge about AI. And that's where literacy plays a very important role.
Great, thank you. More questions? Yes.
What pathways do you believe are best for encouraging and pushing for these kinds of regulations that you've discussed, especially as the economic incentives of companies are often misaligned with more aggressive and pro-social regulations?
Yeah, so that is one of the risks, right? If you don't impose regulation on companies, they might voluntarily take action, which they have been trying to do in the past. But the problem is that if your competitor doesn't do it, you might have a disadvantage competitively speaking. So that's why I am convinced you need some sort of binding regulation. The way the EU went about it is the hard stick. So if you don't comply with the AI Act, there are quite severe financial penalties. Of course, that's not going to be imposed immediately. There is a whole process. You need to be first, someone needs to file a complaint, or a supervisory authority at national level must find out that you're not complying with the regulation. There will be also a legal process. It's a rule of law. So you can then say that you did not breach the AI Act. There's a back and forth there. You can defend yourself. But at the end of the day, if you don't comply, you can incur severe financial penalties. of up to 6% or more of your annual turnover. And for some companies, that can hurt. Everything, however, has to do with enforcement there. Because if you have strong regulations, but then your enforcement mechanism doesn't work, of course, not all companies will feel as incentivized. I think next to this hard stick of financial penalties, there is also reputation. So damage to your reputation. If it turns out that you infringed the AI Act, or there was a massive data leak, or you breached certain fundamental rights, this negative press is also something that some companies at least are scared of. Now, I have to say, for the largest companies like Google, etc., they're so used to incur financial penalties, whether it's for consumer protection law or competition law, that they just bill it into their annual turnover. They just have a little reserve for all the financial penalties that we'll need to pay this year for whichever breaches we incur. That's a little bit disheartening, which also means that the largest companies will, as usual, get away with more than smaller companies. But again, there's not that much the law can do about it. It will come down to enforcement. Enforcement at the public level, but also at the private level. So it's also important that individuals, even through class actions, come forward and enforce regulatory mechanisms that are already there.
Actually, some other question came in from Leuven, I guess, one of the students in the AI for everyday in everyday life. And it's a question about India, the Indian subcontinent. And he's wondering whether you know of any good example from that region.
So I have to say, I am not well versed at all in Indian legislation on AI. To my knowledge, there is at least no sweeping AI regulation out there, but India has been quite active when it comes to data and regulating data, also setting up data commons. So that might be somewhere to look at, but I'm not going to be able to answer more than that, I'm afraid.
Hi, thank you for the speech. Basil Borgatsem from the Belgian delegation here at the UN, and we just finished negotiating a global digital compact, which went off the recommendations from the AI advisory board. And so we will be creating an AI office sometime next year. I imagine that'll come into force. And then more importantly, as an international community, we've decided to come up with a independent scientific panel on AI and a global dialogue on AI, which should take place between governments more or less every year, I would guess. But something that struck me in these regulatory approaches and in maybe the discussions that are taking place at the international level is that whilst maybe Western states are more concerned about safety, guardrails, and you saw that in the executive decree that was taken by President Biden. Whenever we try to have these conversations on an international level with the Global South, their main concern is really about where do the benefits of AI go? And so you have the centralization versus democratization debate, and they really see the benefits as being very lopsided. And so the entire argument becomes about technology transfer and capacity building because they do not have the infrastructure to effectively benefit from these things. I predict that the discussion to effectively get more people around the table in terms of regulating the substance, the content of AI, will constantly get sidetracked by these demands for also getting relevant access to that technology. So I mean, we'll see where the next year goes, but it's definitely a complicated matter, and I wondered whether to what degree that enters into your research these calls from the Global South to basic access to the technology, which for a lot of reasonable reasons related to infrastructure, education, and so on, just aren't there.
Yeah, that's a very important point. And actually, Benedetta also briefly mentioned in her talk the labor issues, for instance, that are also part of this large AI ecosystem, of which the Global South suffers much more negative consequences. So the benefits are not evenly distributed and the disadvantages are not evenly distributed. And sometimes when I talk with colleagues from there, it's ironic that we're talking about, AI regulation and high-risk systems, whereas even basic infrastructures are not yet everywhere placed there. And if you're very cynical, you could even see, the capacity building of AI, to which a lot of funding is now going in these countries as a sort of paving the path towards just having more technology from the US and other regions sold there. And just like making a market there as well for technologies of which we're not even sure yet, at least for some of them, that we want and that they're truly beneficial for society, or the way in which they can be made beneficial. So regulatory convergence, while it is something we need, at least for some of the high-risk systems, and while having regulation that at least spans, those countries where these systems are being built is important, at the same time, we also need some regulatory experimentation in these countries to fit it to the problems arising in those countries. And it's very logical that some of the concerns will be different. The way I see it, there is a horizontal layer of concerns that probably affects the whole of humanity. And then there will be concerns that will be way more tailored to each region and country, depending on the level at which they're at. And I mean level in terms of adoption, both of AI systems, but also of basic infrastructure. I don't think, however, that the solution is to just pump money to countries that don't have these infrastructures that fuels the adoption without critical thinking of how that adoption can best suit their ends, rather than the ends of companies that just want to sell their technology there as soon as possible. And that's something that the UN will have to face, I think.
Any of the regulatory frameworks that you outline, do they have restrictions on or require environmental assessments?
That's a very good question. And I think, as Benedetta already mentioned, you can say it's a missed opportunity. So the European Parliament, when it comes to EU regulation, because that's the framework I know best, the European Parliament at some point introduced an environmental impact assessment and at least mandated some more transparency about the environmental footprint of some systems, but that did not make the cut ultimately. So the European Council did not agree with these changes. And so ultimately what we have in the AI Act is just very subpar when it comes to this. I think avenues in order to incorporate it into codes of practices. So for instance, for generative AI systems, the idea is that there will be codes of practices to implement the obligations they have. You might be able to put some of this environmental analysis over there. And more generally, I think we're also going to have to look at existing laws. When it comes to, for instance, human rights regulation, we did not have a human right to a clean environment, but through a broader interpretation of existing rules, we have a lot of climate litigation making use of these existing rules. And I think this is probably the way to go also when it comes to environmental costs of AI systems. But I think Benedetta might be able to say more about that.
I think I will take that opportunity to open up the debate to all speakers, and I invite also Frank to come here. And this is a nice opportunity to allow Benedetta to also expand on this question. So thanks for having a question that opens up this panel discussion.
Sure. Yes, thank you for the question. I think actually Nathalie was very clear about what happened with the European Council, but the most frightening debate, I think, happened with the Council of Europe, because within the Council of Europe in early drafts, we had very clear intervention on the environment, and many of us really actually worked very hard to have them, and then towards the end, I'm afraid they disappeared. And I actually think the UN here has a great opportunity, because when you talk about the needs of the Global South, which, as I was just discussing with Bike just earlier, is a typical issue of invisibility very often. We don't talk about these needs and the so-called benefits, right, of this type of technologies. Well, then we have a problem, especially for the Global South, because the problem is not just coming up with the right regulation immediately, but actually it's a problem of deciding on investments and strategies and to what extent development is leading to benefit. So first we need to have a policy conversation, and then we will address the regulatory issues. But
Okay, thank you. I like the fact that you actually make the invisible visible, which is also a role that we can take when we're shaping the future as well, because oftentimes we tend to focus on either regions or people that we take for granted. But maybe we can use this opportunity to expand a little bit. What are the things that in your presentations or what in common debates are not so much addressed? Any of you, maybe Nathalie, you would like to expand on that?
You can find a way to. I will help. Thank you. Yeah, I think so. I usually, my circles are usually in law schools and legal environments. And I think one thing that is often missing in legal and policy debates, at least in my view, is this broader societal impact, the systemic risks of AI systems, not just on these, human rights that we do talk about, but on a much more even philosophical level. The fact that our reliance or overdependence perhaps in the future on AI systems can erode our capacity for critical thinking. And I think this goes back to some of the things that Frank said. This is not something that law or policy really has a good answer to, and this is probably also why it's not discussed as much. But if we talk about, regulation to protect liberal democracy, well, our capacity for critical thinking is fundamental to protect liberal democracy because it requires citizens that engage, that discuss, that are exposed to different points of views, that deliberate with each other despite having these different views. Whereas our exposure to AI systems, especially coupled with this centralization, where there are few AI systems that we interact with and that feed us kind of limited information in a very, in snippets, very easily, straight to the point, because we kind of become lazy. We don't want to have a very long answer. We don't want to have contradictory answers. This can be detrimental for our capacity for both moral judgment and political judgment. And this is something I don't think we talk about enough in legal and policy circles, precisely because we still don't know the answer to that. It's not going to come from law. We're going to need something further there. Yeah.
And also, for example, like, again, bringing the discussion and the conversation to the global south, we often fail to engage with ideas that don't come from the Western world. And for example, I've been reading the Ubuntu Declaration on Artificial Intelligence, and actually the needs that are actually explained in this declaration, and also the views and the values that are coming from very different values compared to ours. Or for example, Indigenous Declaration, and I'm reading a lot of those specifically because they help us in understanding environmental harm. And they help us, for example, re-evaluating frameworks of custodianship. What does it mean to be custodians of the planet? What does it mean to be custodians of nature? Can we live with nature in a different way? If so, then what kind of technology should we develop if we decide that this is our priority? And so I think that also this is really often lacking from a conversation and a debate about technological development. And it can be very productive because it really forces us to, and I think with Frank, we had various conversations about the incredible impact that the book by late David Graeber, The Dawn of Everything, has had on our values, like trying to trace back ideas of social justice to actually the Indian Americans that had been in contact with revolutionaries also of the West. And therefore, the ideas of the French Revolution or the ideas of the American Revolution were so present in this thinking about how to organize society. So the Indian Americans were able to create a society that could adjust and had the flexibility to adjust very quickly to changes. And it sounds really like us today in 2024, having to adjust to constant weather events. So all of this is fascinating and certainly should lead us to a different kind of understanding.
Thank you. I'm still looking into. take your mic. Okay, we're using technology. I'm still looking into the audience and also the representative of the online audience, but in the physical audience, there's a question or a comment tapping into this current discussion or opening new avenues. Yes, the floor is yours.
Jean-Marie Aerts, KU Leuven, part of the Digital Society Institute, Department of Biosystems. First of all, I would like to thank all the speakers for the very nice presentations. During the presentations, there was one question that came up in my mind and maybe addressing all the speakers. That is that AI is, let's say, a technical revolution, but it's not the first one. I mean, the last 100 years, we had several technical revolutions, and my question is about the lessons learned. Can we use the lessons that we have learned from the other technical revolutions also for this revolution? And what is your vision on this? Because it's a new technology, but the fact that we have a technological revolution is not new at all. So what is your vision on this aspect?
Yes, I think that's a wonderful question about learning from history. And I'll give a very narrow one and then maybe think about broader implications later. But one of the things I think about as someone who has taught intellectual property law is that every time there's sort of a major change in the copying and dissemination of works, there have often been changes to the law. So for example, you saw like with the player piano, that led to, originally, I believe, scrolls in the player piano were not seen as copies. So then they had to change the, I've been cut off, okay. Oh, thank you. The scrolls were not, I think I've offended the anti-IP folks, no, but anyway, so they changed the scrolls, they had to change the copyright law, I believe, in 1907 or in the early 20th century in the US to do this. And then, you know, you later had new laws on broadcast retransmissions, and you had laws in the 70s dealing with the spread of copying machines and other things like that, and laws in the 1990s, like the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, other areas of law where the law needed to be updated desperately in order to respond to the technological revolutions in there. And I actually just published an article with Hao-Chen Sun on how generative AI may be, in a way, more profound revolution than all those other ones. And I realize I don't want to go too far into the hype. I realize that, you know, but I feel like it's quite something because you have for the first time technologies which are potentially absolutely replacing people, right? Like I could just, if there's a great comic artist, like there's a guy named Greg Rutkowski, I could, without further regulation, just go onto ChatGPT and say, please make me a painting in the style of Greg Rutkowski, okay? And that would entirely replace that person's work. And so with that respect, given that we've had these different interventions in law to change the law in order to keep up with the technological change, I think that's an area where we really have to do that again. I fear, though, that we might not do it again, because I think in those prior revolutions, the content industries were strong enough to kind of get things through, or at least get things to the point where they were negotiating with others and they needed to negotiate with them. I think now the relative power of the tech versus the content industry has totally changed. And so that's going to be a really interesting dynamic to see if we're able to keep up with this change, or if we're sort of stuck frozen in amber with old legal approaches that came up before this new technology.
I'll very briefly follow up on that as well. I think one important lesson when it comes to regulating technology, then, it's again my perspective, is the fact that we probably need to make sure that this dichotomy between law and innovation doesn't perpetuate. And what I mean with that is very often, and I think someone already said it, law is kind of juxtaposed to innovation. Law is always running behind on new technologies. And I think that's a wrong narrative. It just depends also on how you design and develop laws. And I think there is a lot to learn from past technologies when it comes to that. If you design your laws in a very narrow, technology-specific way, yes, the law will run behind, because if you define technology super specifically, there will always be something that doesn't fit the definition, and then you can escape regulation. But if you have a more broader technology neutral law that doesn't define, in detail what the technology is, but that more broadly focuses on, for instance, on the harms that you don't want to have, regardless of which type of technology you use to commit those harms, your regulations are going to just last much longer. They're going to be way more future-proof. Now, it's not that easy. There is a trade-off there, because the more imprecise your definition, the more legal uncertainty you introduce, the more companies might, you know, wonder, am I actually falling under this piece of regulation or not? So there is a trade-off when you go broader and when your legislation is vaguer. At the same time, it can co-evolve over time. And, you know, thinking of the Belgian legal system, many of our liability rules still go back to Roman time and Roman law. So you cannot say that law always runs behind on innovation. It just depends on how you design your laws. And this is where, as lawyers, we need to do an as good job as possible.
Question from the audience.
Yes, please. My question has to do with the role of AI in journalism and misinformation, more broadly. Also, I'd like to come back to that, your answer to that question, and ask about the relative ability, intelligence of lawmakers to even draft a law that would cover any of this, because our experience has been that they are way behind that kind of ability and in making themselves educated enough to really understand what they're legislating.
Okay, Benedetta?
I think I could be speaking for probably 3 hours about these problems of the relationship between AI and journalism. And I could speak about that from a political economic perspective, or from a legal perspective, or a philosophical perspective. And I start with the philosophical problems we have. So very often when we talk about the uptake of generative AI, we don't actually think of the incredible revolution of the last actually less than that, since May, that Google brought to us by introducing, without warning, the so-called Google overviews. And I want you to reflect on it, because having introduced Google overviews means that progressively, as citizens and users, we be staying on the platform instead of being directed to news websites, for example, or to the sources, right? And this is already creating massive problems for journalism that journalists actually are not yet admitting to, because in media reporting, we don't see this happening. But in terms of the problems for the public sphere, the problems of generating an enlightened consensus, the problem of informing, this is really a major issue that has been brought to us without a conversation and without any possibility to even think of a regulation. It just happened one day in May, and we've been told that overviews were starting to knock at our door. And after that, Apple rushed to say, we're going to do the same, and the new iPhone will carry generative AI. So what has happened in the last 3 months is that most of the big global media companies have rushed to sign deal also with OpenAI, saying, we're going to give you the content, okay? And in this way, the content will be fed to us. Okay. And in this way, talking about what Frank and Nathalie were referring to, like the laziness of, you know, the fact that then we are served the content and we don't look to develop our critical thinking because we think we don't need it. It's also a problem of attention and attention economy. We don't have so much time, right? So if Google fed us with a very good answer, then we think it's a good answer. It's something that we might think truthful, then we don't look and we don't go to a website of a journalist organization. So these are huge issues, right?
Or journalists producing content,
Yeah.
the overtaking of local journalism by private equity companies, leading to fewer journalists and therefore more use of AI on the page of your local newspaper, which may or may not be.
Sure.
So if I could follow up on that. Oh, yes, I'll rephrase the question for the online audience, which is a follow-up question, sort of questioning the problem of the decline of local journalism, which in turn leads to potential over-reliance on AI-produced material or other material in these venues. And I would go back even a little bit further than the current problem there to look at where did all the ad revenue go, right? And right now, we're in the midst of an antitrust trial against Google with respect to its ad tech and with respect to essentially its essential monopolization or accused monopolization of various aspects of ad tech. There's a report that actually came out that said that if Google and Facebook were to pay about a proper amount to these local journalists and other news sources, that it would be $9 to $13 billion a year, which could hire, literally thousands of journalists, to work and to still be playing that role. And I think that decline is a really profound one. And I think that the problem now is that because the sort of externalities of tech centralization are not properly being taken into account, there are these flows of funds away from distributed expertise, which is sort of the theme of my book, New Laws of Robotics. And I do have a chapter on journalism in that, or on automated media, I should say, where I mention journalism. I feel like that's a really profound problem that we're only starting to get back at. I remember actually about 6 or 7 years ago, I think I actually was an endorser for this one law that was proposed by David Cicciolini that would have allowed newspapers to collectively bargain vis-a-vis technology firms, right? So that they could say, you don't get our content. Because right now it's just like, if you say, well, you don't get our content, well, then there'll be 100 others that will provide the content. You need some level of collective bargaining to have that type of relationship. And that's one of the things that'll be really interesting as AI becomes more powerful, more centralized. Are those who it is displacing or whose work it's using going to find ways to politically organize and collectively bargain for a better future against it? Or is there going to be a situation where it just becomes like a rehash of the same dynamics that we saw with respect to other aspects of the digital public sphere? So, thanks.
Yeah, I want to briefly answer to your point on whether regulators or legislators at all have a clue, because I think it's an important point, and I want to push a little bit back on it as well. So the argument that legislators are not capable, right, to regulate this technology is one that you often hear from tech companies, because it also suits them to say, oh, well, these regulators, they don't know anything about AI. Who are they to impose any type of regulation? They have no clue. Let's explain them. And maybe we can write the legislation for them. That's even easier. So we need to push back a little bit against that. Also because going back to the question that was asked earlier, it's not the first time that legislators had to deal with very complex things that they had to regulate, right? What are legislators? At the end of the day, it's democratically elected people, right? Doesn't mean they're necessarily the brightest, but they're, let's say, people like you and me who need to grapple with tons of issues. Some of these issues they have a clue about, either because they studied it or because they use it. Maybe it's more simple, but some of these things are very complex. Think of complex safety legislation or food or medical devices. Many legislators don't have a clue about it, but we have devised over decades and centuries mechanisms to try to get information to legislators. They can hear experts, they can talk with people, they can ask stakeholders for advice, they can do public consultations on what's the best thing to do. And that's, for instance, the model that the EU followed to come to its AI Act, right? It took a few years to get there because it consulted with experts, it consulted with the public at large. Then there was a European Parliament that debated on it for years. And then eventually they came to a solution. It doesn't mean it's a good solution, but it's a more informed solution, despite the fact that many of these parliamentarians don't have any AI background. And it's something that we've seen in the past as well with very other technical topics. So I think we need to push back on the idea that legislators, even though they don't understand exactly how the technology works, cannot take action against it. They just need to inform themselves. But then at the end of the day, it's a political decision, because hearing experts, they will all have a different answer depending on what their point of view is and what their interests are. At the end of the day, it's not just about expertise, it's just political will as well.
Okay, we can take one more question from the audience because I'm also a timekeeper, and if I'm not mistaken, I direct in.
Yeah, thank you. I have the mic, so I'll be the last question. Okay, thank you. Very interesting conversation. A quick comment maybe, and which is also a question. It's a bit hard to say it in the School of Law, but I feel that maybe legislation may be a necessary but not a sufficient condition to get where we would like to get when it comes to AI. I think there's a lot of conditions that need to be, which might be structural, but also capabilities. And I think Nathalie already mentioned a little bit, there is something on AI literacy in the Act, but not that much. And my question to you maybe is that we don't talk that much about the capabilities on the side of the users, etc. And coming from an institution of higher education, right, you can see that AI is sort of, generative AI is sort of like, ooh, students are going to cheat. But really, I think we're talking about sort of knowledge building and new ways and really creating those critical skills, right, for all the way from primary education, maybe all the way through to, you know, whatever. And I would like to hear your comments on that. Where do you see, is that all of you maybe, where do you see that is really happening or not yet? Or, you know, are we sort of ignoring that bit while we wait for good legal frameworks and maybe wait for structural reconditioning, dealing with all these things where, you know, what are we doing about people's capabilities to deal with this? Sorry if that's.
Yeah, I want to make a bridge actually from the last question to this one about the concern about journalism and about the concern about sort of AI literacy. I mean, to begin with, I would just say that I have seen that the Finnish program for Finnish students to understand biases and problems, you know, and understand where people are coming from, apparently is a very useful and powerful program that they've developed for there. So I think that's one model of AI literacy that begins early on. But I also just wanted to propose something that just to dramatize how difficult these issues could be. You could imagine a future where, you know, the vast transfer of ad revenue from local journalism to AI intermediaries, including those that are advancing AI, has led them, you know, there's not much local journalism left. And a lot of these intermediaries are trying to, with their summaries, you know, which these sort of like generative AI summaries in response to search queries, are like, you might ask them, for example, what happened yesterday in the war in Ukraine? Well, they might try to take the news from various different sources and just mash it all up into some AI summary. So you don't have to pay for any particular newspaper, you just get that summary. But of course, once that starts happening, if that takes off, whereby people, instead of going to a news source, are going to Google or ask or question, or just asking random questions to ChatGPT about what the news is, that in turn creates an incentive for those that want to bias the news to try to create more and more news that floods the corpus so that their point of view becomes what the summary is, right? So we have to train people that essentially the decision about what's in the corpus is incredibly determinative of what are the ultimate answers. Remarkably, though, these companies are getting away with not telling us what's in the corpus. They're saying, oh, it's all a trade secret, et cetera, right? So that is the royal road to mass disinformation. And I mean, I even see something smaller like this happening with respect to polling now. There's all these polls that are out there, many of which are partisan polls, many of which are saying, you know, this one candidate is definitely going to win or is always ahead, et cetera, et cetera. And it's like, that's just trying to set the framework for later legal battles so that they can challenge if they lose and say, oh, you know, the polls said we're going to win, but look, we're going to lose, et cetera. So I think that's I'm very passionate about this because I feel like if we don't have that type of policing and public literacy about the manipulability of these summaries, it's really troubling. Last point I'll just make is someone actually proposed that generative AI be used to help with contract interpretation, okay? And they do point in their article, this is an article by Hoffman and Yarbell, they say, well, yeah, there could be some issues with the corpus, et cetera. I think that's fundamental. It's fundamental to think about, you know, the ways in which these corpora could be manipulated. So I just worry that we're drifting toward a world where we are going to outsource so much thought to these entities that are ultimately quite manipulable in so many different ways.
Okay, thank you. You may have noticed that some of these batteries got low and had to be replaced. So I think this is a sign that we have to recharge not only the materials and the infrastructure, but also the people, and that we're almost up to a break. I hope that we can continue this conversation. So this is not a closure. I would like you to reflect again on the title, which was Aim for the Future or AI of the Future. So maybe during the break, for those who are physically here, there is a break, but also people online. Maybe in the future we can think about playing with the title, whether there is a future with or without AI, and what is the aim linked to AI. So let's continue the conversation. But before we do so, I would like to invite you all to have a big applause for the speakers, for you, the audience online, audience here in the room, and for everyone who made this a splendid organization. Thank you all.